So maybe we could just start by asking a very basic question, which is we're talking about a new space policy. How do you understand President Trump's space policy's most distinctive features? What are the distinctive features about policy now that didn't apply 3 years ago? Maybe I could start with Aubrey.
Could we start with Paul, please?
No, you're next to me.
No, absolutely. No, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak here. And I want to thank especially the organizers and also my leadership that are allowing me to be able to speak to you all in my own personal capacity. To that end, my thoughts are going to be my own, even though I am employed by the Air Force Academy. The landscape right now is shifting a lot. We're seeing a lot of executive order type of work, which is shifting the policy landscape towards innovative spaces that haven't otherwise been regulated. And so we're seeing some very, very exciting innovation opportunity. However, for folks that have been in the space for a while, the landscape that allows you the sort of predictability that we're used to seeing in this area, especially from various different regulators in the launch and also in the innovation spaces for satellites, is shifting dramatically. And so right now we're seeing a centric American approach, which can have implications for Artemis and other types of norms-based behaviors that we were once looking for pursued.
Can you bring that out a little bit more? What are the implications you're thinking of?
Well, when you're talking about Artemis, you're really talking about buy-in, you're talking about cooperation across lines of countries, nation states, coalitions. And now we're starting to see a bit of a shift towards areas that have not otherwise been regulated at all.
Okay, Brian, what do you think is distinctive about the new shift in space policy?
Yeah, I was going to look at his notes first, but I think that there's such a significant emphasis when you look at all kind of the recent policies, even from the Commercial Space Act, some of the dynamics from the AI Action Plan, as well as the Big Beautiful Act in general. Now it's really driving this innovative perspective on the commercial mesh with defense, right? This dual use application, which isn't necessarily new. I look at it as a tri-use because I look at civil applications in general, but I see it as such a significant opportunity for innovation, both from the entrepreneurial perspective as well as from institutions in general.
People often talk about you must not see things as difficulties, you must see them as opportunities. If you put on your more negative thinking hat and saw this in terms of not of opportunities but of difficulties, what do you see as the difficulties being raised by new approaches to space policy?
Well, I think when you look at ITAR export controls, they have some limiting factors associated with it that curtails some levels of innovation. But it's also, it's a double-edged sword, right? So I think we have to look at things in a very different way. So I can be incredibly critical from that perspective, but I do think that it's an opportunity for, the U.S. to think more dynamically about opportunities in general.
Kareem, as someone who works on propulsion and on possibilities of hypersonic flight, how do you understand changes in the policy in the policy space, and are they driven by, in your estimation, sort of like an accurate sense of what's going on in your engineering world, or are they somewhat divorced from that?
I mean, it's heavily defense focused, so there is an uptick in need to go faster and develop products a bit quicker and mass production.
I'm not trying to find, but are you talking about technologies that develop faster or technologies that actually move from A to B faster?
No, I'm talking about from the policy perspective. Okay. How do we get to things faster as a product for hypersonics? Mm-hmm. So there is an uptick in need for hypersonics and space access that we're seeing that there are options that we could utilize compared to in the past.
And are there policy constraints on those, or is policy basically where you need it to be?
Where you need it to be.
Okay, that's always helpful to know. Yeah. Paul, I wanted to come to you. What's your view of what's distinctive now about the new turn in space policy?
Well, thank you, and thank you for accommodating me coming in on Zoom. Delighted to participate. I would say that President Trump and the current administration are in the process of reprising their previous role as very positive disruptors in space. President Trump created the Space Force. His sort of reinstitution of the National Space Council in the first term was a tremendous success. And I think this administration views space correctly as a military domain, as a warfighting domain. Not that we need to lead with that, but that we need to be conscious of that. And that wars are being fought in space as well as in cyberspace and the more traditional physical spaces and so being prepared for that is important. And the corollary to that is our civil and civilian capabilities are important both from an economic perspective, but also supporting that national security capability. And I think this administration understands that, and as it settles in with the new leadership team, I think we'll see a lot more progress like we did in the first term.
Thank you. Brian, I'm intrigued that I know in some of your writings you've stressed that space policy isn't only about what happens in space, but also in areas like financial regulation and access to capital markets. Yeah. How is there a policy shift there, or does there need to be?
It needs to evolve, number one. And, I look at the largest challenge, and I was saying this on the last roundtable, is that the largest challenge that I see is the confluence between capital markets and the regulatory environment.
And
regulatory, right? So when you start to look at that, they're looking for norms, right? They're looking for standardization, some level of consistency across that. And I believe that we're working towards that, but perhaps not as fast as we should or need to, as Paul was kind of characterizing in general. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity when you start to think about how to be, I'm not going to say that use the term agile or even adaptive. We need to anticipate, because the speed of change is impacting every single sector. And when I say that, space is impacting every single sector. Space technologies, as well as looking at operations and how they leverage space in general. So that's why I do think that from a capital markets perspective, looking at some level of norms or standards is critical, right? But within any industry, we see that, regulations is always trying to catch up with the current state.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go to one of the Slido questions now, because I think it bears on that to some extent. Anonymous question about, as you see more, I see a bold program of acquisition from the Space Force. How do you worry about that crowding out the commercial sector, either in terms of money or in terms of policy bandwidth? Is there a conflict there between the military and the civilian? Maybe you'd care to come in on that, Paul.
Thank you. I think I see it as a risk, certainly, but I think the potential upside is very substantial. And we're seeing just now the Department of War is putting out an update to its acquisition strategy that will unfold in more detail in the coming days. But I think there's a clear understanding that we have a more or less broken acquisition model at the Department of War, and a lot of effort is going into improving that. And part of that is a reimagining of the relationship between the Department of War as a customer and the defense industrial base generally, and the space defense industrial base in particular. As we look back to our ability to scale up for production in World War II, not that we're headed for anything similar right now, but as we looked at that capability, I think there are some lessons that we can draw from that we're trying to apply right now.
Thank you. Aubrey, do you also see this coalescence of this joining over the lines that previously divided civil and military space policy?
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, if you know, the most recent executive order that was just promulgated here, 14355, really emphasizes pre-need relationships with industrial partners. So instead of what used to be a very complex, and Paul was kind of alluding to some of this, federal acquisitions structure, which can sometimes take years to go ahead and put things into development after going ahead and developing what you want to go ahead and purchase. When you have a pre-need partnership already in place, then that agility increases many, many fold.
So, what is a pre-need partnership?
Well, so I think that when working with some of our industrial partners, I think that they have the ability to see some of the things before we think that we even need them. So in other words, where the Department of War would have been, okay, we're going to create a product, we're going to go ahead and write a requirement, can industry go ahead and build it for us? If we're partnering early on with industry, they can see things well in advance, maybe of some of the things that we're seeing. And if we're working together in that regard, then we can go ahead and build it as we literally ride the bike.
Kareem, as someone working in research, are you seeing this change to a more upstream dialogue between people thinking of what can be done and before being asked what should be done?
Yeah, we're seeing that shift in our research perspective, and there's, as I noted earlier, there's calls for how to go faster with new innovative solutions that could be done differently than what has been done with legacy systems. So,
One of the continuities has been in space policy has been that America has been building around the Artemis Accords for some time now. Do you see that as being an example of successful international outreach? Is there something that you would rather have seen differently about it, any of you?
Well, I'm certainly happy to go ahead and provide some comments on Artemis. I think Artemis is really strong in the sense that it is built around a mission. And I think really any type of successful endeavor has a clear vision and end state in mind. So we know exactly what we're trying to accomplish here, and then people figure out what their roles are going to be when accomplishing that goal. And it also has a great way of giving us what they call soft law, or something that gives us some normative architecture, so that when we start switching into congressional riders, or even perhaps even a treaty one day that builds off of the 67 Outer Space Treaty, we already have the infrastructure in place, and we've already agreed on what we're going to agree on, and more importantly, we've agreed on what we're going to disagree on, sort of as a coalition of nation states. And we're seeing this already play out in AUKUS, with the UK and also with the Australians.
AUKUS is an interesting comparison there.
AUKUS, yes.
But I'm intrigued. You mentioned the possibility of negotiating a successor to the 1967 Space Treaty. I've been thinking recently that the idea of getting any international treaty negotiated looks harder and harder. Do you actually think that's a possibility? And do you think it's a possibility? B, do you think it's desirable?
Well, I think that there are going to be people that are going to be on both sides of this.
I would hope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the interesting thing is, if you were to take any of the national legislative architectures as an example, much like Brandeis would say, kind of laboratories of democracy, you're going to, it's going to be an uphill fight. I think it's going to be an uphill fight. And I think the answer is that we agree on what we're going to agree on. So, like, for example, if we're looking at quantum communication, if you have a quantum satellite that's able to go ahead and have an undetectable signal, how do you regulate that? Well, I think that we could probably agree in advance on how we're going to do that, because it really doesn't harm anybody. And so if we were to take that sort of in a larger context for things like liability, or even safe spaces between satellites, or especially in LEO where it's very, very congested, I think that we can agree on what we agree on very easily, and then we use that as sort of a building block. And so much like you would see in the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, you would have a similar thing for the Outer Space Treaty, which is essentially, sort of a non-proliferation architecture. And if you were to bring that forward, how do we make that make sense for business?
It's a mixture of a non-proliferation architecture and effectively the Antarctic Treaty.
Indeed.
But that would be but given the constraints that the Antarctic Treaty puts on exploitation, I'd have thought that would be the area where I would be thinking you'd be maybe wanting some differences, some change. Brian?
I do think that I agree with everything you said. I think, you have to kind of reimagine, a treaty that's 50 plus years old. in general. I do think that there's a need for it, number one. I think number two, the desire for it, to my point before about establishing international norms and standards to enhance capital markets, sure, I think there is, but this isn't about faster horses. This is about kind of reimagining what the possibilities are from both commercial exploration as well as collaboration, more importantly, and defining that in strategic horizons, meaning it's not about these gigantic leaps that everyone wants to take. They're strategic hops, right? It's looking at progressively getting better and focusing on how we collaborate more effectively for speed to preserve access to space as well as exploration.
And that leads to actually one of the questions from Slido, from Wes, which is the question of speeding things up to a one-stop shop for interaction between the private space sector and licensing authorities. Is that something that's, and I think that you'd be hard put to find someone who wouldn't say it was desirable, but is that what are the difficulties to doing that?
Well, there's a myriad of different things that are, I mean, that's, how many colors are there in the world? But yes, it is desirable, number one. I think number two, it's looking at more of kind of a structured approach, similar to what you were characterizing as a starting point, right? I do think that there are potential barriers in ways of working, the ways that some of our allies work, some governments work together, as well as with policies. Some counteract each other, while others truly complement. So the key thing is here, how do we increase our speed? Because speed's going to help capital injection, innovation, as well as collaboration, and actually getting ahead with regulations. I know that's aspirational, but that's kind of my point of view.
Yeah, and if I may add,
Yeah, of course.
I think that if we are, there's a lot of things that we can agree on, and I think one of the things that we can really agree on are the processes.
Yeah.
We already know that there's going to be issues that come up. There's going to be problems. There's going to be perhaps even conflict. Why not try to make a mechanism right now that says, hey, this is how we're going to resolve disputes. This is how we're going to resolve problems and bring things to market faster that way. And once we agree on the mechanism, that gives you enough certainty to go ahead and probably start moving towards the next incremental goal, like you're talking about, Brian.
Paul, does that accord with your view of the situation?
Yeah, from the commercial space industry's perspective, having a streamlined process for regulatory approval is a high priority, and having it be as close to a one-stop shop as possible is a high priority. In general, we prefer having it have a more commercial approach than a transportation approach, for example, or other approach, because there's a lot more happening in space than just getting to space. And so the opportunity to build on things like the Artemis Accords and say, okay, now we're interested in resource utilization in space. Now we're interested in staying in space. We're interested in doing a variety of different things in space. Being able to offer that as an easy process, a fast process, a process defined by the rule of law. Those are all ways that the United States can be competitive internationally and be essentially the flag of choice for people who want to be involved in space.
Okay, question coming in from one of our anonymous slidees. The National Space Council. Restore it? Is it an important part of the policy process, or are we already set with what we have? I'm gonna ask Brian. Brian looks like he's very question.
I don't play poker very well. I do think it's critical. I also think the intersect and remit with the Office of Space Commerce, as well as other elements, is also paramount to the success. But it's agreeing upon, again, this trajectory of what the expectations are for the Space Council over the 12 to 18 months and projecting forward. So this way there's a continuous focus on progress versus stasis.
I mean, historically, sorry.
No, and you're just to riff on that a little bit. It's this idea of having kind of a shared mission and goal, in mind. So if we can agree on the principles that we all are agreeing upon. If you look at Artemis, I mean, last I checked, it was at 60 nation states, and that means that people are looking at it from a principles-based perspective. And this has been now building for years. And so if we have that infrastructure already in place, the institution itself will help us resolve those problems.
I'm going to come back to Artemis just in a minute, but I want to ask something about the Space Council. Historically, the Space Council role has been associated with the Office of the Vice President. Does Vice President Vance have any particular interest in space? I haven't noted any particular statements that he's made on this, but I don't follow things as closely as I'm sure you guys do.
I think he's waiting for other appointments first to have more of a cohesive view of where we need to be going. I know that's a very generic view, but I do think looking at NASA, looking at some of the other agencies working together, there needs to be that cohesion. I do think that he could help lead with vigor of what truly needs to happen over the next 12 to 18 months.
But it's something that he would do as part of his service. It's not something that you think he's particularly motivated by?
I could not tell. I do think that he could execute the plan, the strategy, scope of, but you would need to fill other spots, specifically NASA.
Well, I was
and
just,
others.
I mean,
I know where you're going, but but that's my opinion. That's my opinion. I don't think it's if he has any type of opinion or passion for it. It's just more about can he execute the job.
Paul, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, if I could. I mean, I like to think about what makes the National Space Council successful or not. And I think nobody expected the National Space Council under Trump 1 to be successful because it hadn't been in the past. And it was surprisingly extremely successful because it had a president who cared, a vice president who cared and actually showed up and ran the meetings, members of the council who did the homework, and a staff that was incredibly good. And if we have a similar mix of ingredients this time around, it will be good.
So do you think Scott Pace should be waiting for a phone call?
I'm all for employing Scott Pace in whatever job he chooses, but I'm not here to, foist that on him or campaign for him.
That's a nice answer. I wanted to come back though to another question about Artemis, which seems to have vanished from my screen, but I'm sure that I remember it. And it was a question to you, Aubrey. And how much does the Artemis Accord process matter when China has been on the moon for a year or two and America isn't?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, we are, as Paul was talking about a little bit earlier, space is now really truly a contested domain of warfare. And so we don't want to, to escalate it in such a way that we're forgetting about what it really is that we're there to do. And that's why I think the Space Council and other types of organizations and other types of institutions are so incredibly important. I mean, even during the height of the Cold War, we had already decided about how we're going to communicate, how we're going to have a dialogue, and how we're going to make common sense decisions, irrespective of what we're all independently doing on our own. And that's why I think these types of initiatives are so very, very important. I mean, if you have a phone on your desk where you can literally get the voice in the ear of the leaders of the other country, I think that's what we need to focus on, because it's relationships ultimately that I think are going to matter and carry this forward.
But in the Cold War, it was seen as very important to keep NASA as a civilian agency and to keep fairly distinct lines, which I think in an earlier part of this conversation, and certainly in General Olson's presentation earlier, lines that are becoming increasingly blurred. And when I asked you just then about Artemis, you immediately went on to an answer about war. Is that how we should be thinking about policy with respect to the moon and China?
No, it's not. We're talking about a warfighting domain, and we're trying to avoid war at all cost. And in order to do that, you have to communicate. You have to have an infrastructure. And you have to have a methodology in place first. If you don't have that, then people separate. They don't communicate, and things break down very, very quickly. And so that's exactly, I think, what everybody is trying to avoid through these types of normative types of structures.
Well, that actually, though, brings back to mind something that Commissioner Gomez was saying earlier, which is and I think I can say this as someone outside the United States, the catastrophic loss of soft power under this administration. How do you think that the Artemis Accords or any other international space policy adapt to that really significant loss?
Well,
I'll take Brian.
Okay. I think in terms of from the kind of the loss of soft power, you really have to balance that with the kind of the broader ecosystem for space, because it's not just for what was just characterized. It's not just from a military dynamic. It looks at economic, trade, technological data, how we communicate, as well as kind of the social and educational infrastructure. All of that needs to play. And from a U.S. perspective, with that perceived loss of soft power, there's connection points. It's not just because one thing looks like it's, from hard to soft. We're losing that, or it's being diffused. I'll use that term. I do think that, aspects of education around the world, of where we're bringing in and sharing different types of insights, innovation, I think we should be encouraging all of that. I don't think that there is any room for obfuscation in general, and literally keeping clear lines of communications across all these different facets of this ecosystem. I think that is critical.
I just want to push back on this. Maybe you'd like to comment, Paul. It just seems to me that in a situation where America is increasingly on its own, largely through its own actions and statements with respect to many other nations in the world, if China is on the moon first and America says, what about the Artemis Accords, what is your protection against people saying, we don't really care? Paul?
A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, you can't beat something with nothing. And so we have to have a compelling reason to participate with us. And we have to have a program that's worth doing, and we have to have it on terms that are worth engaging. And that's why the Artemis Accords are useful, and the Artemis program is useful. Beyond that, we tend to ask in surveys about space, do you think, the American public, do you think it's important to be doing X or Y or Z in space? And I've always thought that's an incorrect question. The question is, do you think it's important that we do that, given that China is doing that, or given that one of our opponents or competitors is doing that? Because we really do need to not just be reactive, but need to be present in the areas of competition that we think are important. And so I'm pleased that, as Aubrey noted, that we have now 60 nations as of Halloween. Latvia signed on. 60 nations that are part of the Artemis Accords. We are continuing to hold a banner that says the relationship that we're going to have with you as another country in the world is one that's equally binding on you and on us on equal terms. And that we are really trying to establish norms and ways of approaching the moon and the rest of the cosmos that are fair and that are equitable.
In the context of that, we're just running out of time, but one last quick and slightly off question. In terms of norms and things like that, did you personally regret it, any of you, when the description of the goal of the Artemis program, not the Accords, as a goal to put a woman and a person of color onto the moon before 2030, when that was removed from the NASA website, how did you feel about that?
I didn't have any type of.
You had no feeling about.
No, I want to get Americans to space and on the moon as quickly as possible. It's been
In what way
far
was
too
that,
long.
was that slowing down Americans going to the moon?
I'm just saying that's more of a positioning statement at that point in time from the administration.
I was asking in the context of this question about norms.
Oh, about norms. I was just thinking more about how do we move faster. That's it. I mean, it didn't really have any type of impact on me from a positioning point of view or looking at norms of having, that from a diversity point of view.
Okay,
At all.
Aubrey?
I think it's important to keep in context that we're going to build this thing together, irrespective of what background you come from, where you come from. It is going to be a team sport, and I think that we have to definitely approach it as such. And I think that much of that will become transparent. As you see in commercial industry, can you do the math is the question. Can you do the job? And I think that will allow us to go ahead and be able to engage with the people who are interested, passionate, and capable at accomplishing the mission.
Kareem?
So as a technologist, we've been there before and we've done it before. So if we want to do it today, we can, if we want to. So no advancement. We need to go beyond.
Well, that was I think one of the things that struck me about this was that was the way in which Artemis was positioning itself as going beyond, doing something different. But it doesn't seem like that's a difference that matters. Paul?
I would argue that the difference in Artemis is that we're going with the intention of staying and with the intention of developing our capability to go beyond the moon to Mars. And that, to me, is the really the technical difference.
So you had no personal feeling when you saw that proviso removed?
My personal feelings are something I keep very much to myself. But the real issue here is, are we able to do something new? Are we able to do something in an inclusive way? And to include, again, the 60 countries that are signed up with us, and I hope and expect to see more. Clearly, they find this opportunity compelling. Last time we went to the moon on behalf of humanity at large. And that's the spirit that we're proceeding in here.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.